In this video, I will go over a handful of subjects covering, broadly speaking, all you really need to become a solid healer. Whether you are a player picking up healing for the first time, or have some experience with it, I imagine there might be something you didn't know. And if you are getting into healing for the first time, I have guides for every healer in the game that go level by level, so you can start learning from them regardless of what level you are at. Links to all of those guides in the description. Now, if you have a tip to help your fellow healers to improve, I would love to hear about it in the comments. But with that said, let's get started. Number 1. Pulls in a dungeon. While boss fights tend to have a lot more of a, quote, plan for the specific fight, unquote, or alternatively simply responding to what the boss does, AoE pulls in dungeons can typically be split up into 3 parts. The pre-pull, during the pull, and the destination. And depending on what healer you are, and sometimes even what tank you have, how you approach each step might be slightly different. So let's take it one step at a time. The pre-pull. This is the point before you enter combat. This is the best time to set up anything that would otherwise cost you opportunities to, for example, attack once the pull begins. For instance, white mages can set up regen on their tank. Sure, it might not heal much, since the tank will only be missing HP for some part of the duration, but it is basically free. A scholar might use Adloquium to set up a barrier on the tank. Swift casting this can often be super helpful if the tank is already speeding onward. Both barrier healers can also add their healing increasing effect to boost this further if they like. Astrologian has a particularly extreme amount of pre-pull setup they can access. Horoscope, followed by Helios Conjunction, as well as Aspected Benefic. If you want to be even crazier, using Neutral Sect for this adds a shield on top, and makes the healing over time even bigger. Exactly how much of your pre-pull setup you want or need can depend on the duty, or your and your tank's combined skill level, as pre-pull setup can often compensate a bit for these things. The last thing to consider in the pre-pull is Sprint. As Sprint lasts twice as long when used when not in combat, an effective way to use Sprint is to either use it as soon as you see your tank use it to keep up with them, or alternatively use it just before entering combat if for whatever reason your tank is not using it. Whatever the case, this can greatly help you keep up with your tank during a pull. Speaking of which, during the pull. This is the point where you enter combat. Depending on your heal of choice, what you can do during this can vary a bit. For barrier healers, typically following the pack while spamming your AoE attack is a solid choice. Specifically, scholars may also appreciate setting up excogitation on their tank here. Not in the pre-pull, as that means you don't get the fairy gauge. For Astrologian, Lightspeed can enable you to do the same AoE spamming thing. White mages tend to rely on spreading their dot during this run, as holy spam is not super beneficial or very practical at this time. The other 3 healers can also always fall back on spreading their dots depending on target count or maybe being low level. This is also a solid time for pure healers to use their OGCD barriers, Divine Benison and Celestial Intersection. The destination. This is the point where the tank reaches the spot they plan to stay for the remainder of the pull. Having a plan for how you will respond as the pull progresses can help a lot in simplifying a pull. For instance, a sage can benefit greatly from maintaining their 10% damage reduction effect for the majority of a pull. Planning a specific sequence of cooldowns to work through 1 by 1 or 2 by 2, depending on how many you have, can be nice. Knowing which cooldowns you have planned to use for one big pull and which you plan to use for the next can also help you better meter out your options so you don't find yourself lacking options because you're a bit too aggressive with the cooldowns in the previous pull. Sometimes that's what it takes, but you know, a plan can only do so much. Where planning your cooldowns can be the most impactful is in making the most of your long cooldowns. All 4 healers have at least one 2-minute cooldown and one 3-minute cooldown, at least at max level, and often these can help ease a large AoE pull immensely if you just use it. But many healers end up not using them at all, ending up saving them for a panic scenario that is never coming. Of course, if your party is solid and you don't need them, that is also a reason you save them. But if you never use your big cooldowns, you won't be very well acquainted with them when the day comes where you could actually find them helpful. To give a specific example of this, a scholar could choose to use Seraphism at the destination of the first AoE pull, and then choose to use Summon Seraph for the second one. Even if Seraphism is much more helpful when you need to spam spell healing, just using it pulses some free healing anyway that can help. The important part is trying to make sure every cooldown you have has a seat to fill somewhere. The second half to optimizing an AoE pull is also paying attention to what tank you have and how they play. For instance, most warriors tend to let their HP drop a bit before they use their raw intuition or bloodwetting. Assuming the specific warrior is using this cooldown frequently, you can focus on using your options to help smooth out the situation while this crazy option is on cooldown. Some Dark Knights like to use Abyssal Drain in a similar way, but this is more rare, so you may not be able to count on it unless you see them do it first. The important part is paying attention to what your tank is doing. Knowing when they are using defensive cooldowns and when they aren't can also help you to respond in time, or alternatively save some resources when the damage intake slows down. Each tank also has an invulnerability cooldown, but the one to know in particular is the Dark Knight one, Living Dead. When you see this hourglass on a red background, the Dark Knight must take lethal damage before it hits 0 seconds. If they do, they become unable to die, not to be confused with being invulnerable, and will pretty much heal back to full almost all on their own shortly after. When the hourglass turns grey, this is the sign that the effect has activated properly and you don't have to worry about this hourglass staying anymore. If it turns into a red rays looking icon, they have finished healing, but they are still unable to die. Naturally, every tank has its own quirks and nuances, but these are definitely the biggest outliers in my opinion. Understanding the details of how the specific tank you're paired with works can help you to make the most of it. Not that you always need to, of course. Number 2. Healing when needed. A somewhat uncommon mistake some healers make is feeling compelled to maintain an effect constantly on their tank, or their whole party. For instance, choosing to strictly always maintain Regen as a white mage, or feeling compelled to use Adloquium or Evocation Diagnosis if the tank doesn't have a barrier. Both of these examples are a bit extreme depending on how you look at it, however, the general idea still applies. Use healing when it is needed. There is, for example, no need to aggressively top up anyone if the incoming damage doesn't require it. By allowing your team to not be immediately topped up, healing over time effects get to provide a lot more value. Not to mention, if you wait with using your healing options until most or all of the healing they provide will land without overhealing, you may ultimately need to use less healing overall. And of course, when it comes to using healing spells, make sure you use your more potent ones most of the time, meaning Cure 2 over Cure 1 in pretty much all situations. Similarly, while I suggested some players use Regen too frequently, using it when the healing is needed or helpful does make sense. The main point where you might not want to use Regen or similar spell options is if you can cover it with abilities, OGCDs, at no major loss. Number 3. Attacking when you can. A similarly somewhat uncommon mistake some healers make, which goes in both directions, is both never attacking and attacking way too much. For the first half, never attacking, by focusing on healing when needed, the previous tip, you should find yourself with a lot of time in a duty where you have nothing that needs to be done. This is the time you use for attacking. To be clear, I'm not saying that you should be playing chicken with the tank's HP, although some more experienced healers like to do that. I'm just saying, use your healing options more efficiently and then use the time saved to attack with. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, there are also some healers that simply will not use healing spells, even when they don't have other options. In a lot of duties, they might be able to get away with this, especially if the tank and the rest of the group is good too. But there are especially low-level duties where it isn't possible for just any tank to make it without healer intervention. So just remember, when all else fails, it is okay to use healing spells, regardless of what some other guide might have told you. In fact, even when progging actually hard content, not being afraid to use a healing spell when it will really help can massively improve your odds of succeeding. Number 4. Managing your resources. This one might be a bit strange, but what can sometimes cause trouble for some healers is if they burn through all of their resources and cooldowns too quickly by being too quick on the trigger. This can happen even if you follow tip number 2 and make efficient use of your healing. For example, a scholar might choose to use Lustrates aggressively because their tank needs the healing now, and then they have nothing left over to use, for example, Excogitation or Sacred Soil, which, while both are less frequently available, are much more effective. Sacred Soil at higher levels specifically. In such a situation, think about how long you need your resources to last, and allowing yourself to use healing spells when things get tight can end up being a gain in the long run, as once your resources and cooldowns are spent, all you have left is spamming Cure 2 or Adloquium or whatever. When you meter out the resources a bit more smartly, you may need to cast a spell here and there when things aren't going your way, but being able to make the most of every cooldown and resource you have and thinking a bit further ahead may reduce the total number of healing spells you have to use in a fight. To take the Scholar as an example again, you only get 3 Aetherflow stacks per minute, aside from the extras you might get from Dissipation and the free uses from Recitation, so you do have to sort of meter out this resource if you don't know for certain how much of it you will actually need. If you find that you have to lustrate so aggressively that you will go an extended period with 0 Aetherflow, then resorting to Adloquium alongside lustrate before you run out fully can help make the resource last a bit longer. This of course should not be used as a reasoning to sit on all of your cooldowns though. In fact, managing your resources is just as much about deciding when you're going to use what so that you actually end up using them, but simultaneously also thinking far enough ahead that you don't just slam every cooldown and then look around wondering where it all went. Healing, optimally, can be a lot about planning ahead. Number 5. Working with a co-healer. In most boss content you will face, you will have at least one co-healer. In some cases, you can communicate directly with them to make the most of it together, but a lot of the time, you just have to guess and play around them. This one actually goes hand in hand with all of the prior tips, as managing your resources also includes not overburdening yourself by insisting on doing all the healing work yourself, and leaving nothing for your co-healer to do. In Extremes and Savage, the work can be split in a more specific way by planning cooldowns beforehand and such, but in most content easier than that, if you know you would need to use 2 cooldowns to top up your team, use one, and then your co-healer can use the other. You can of course also pay attention to what they do and adjust accordingly, but leaving about half of the work for them is not a bad call. Naturally, pure healers are more likely to take a bit more of the actually healing back up work, while barrier healers are more likely to prevent a bit more of the damage in the first place. But just make sure you don't overspend your resources. In the case of a double barrier healer situation, which can happen and is definitely not uncommon, knowing what things stack and what don't can also help you to not waste your resources or time. For example, 2 sages using Keracholi, the healing part will stack, but the damage reduction will not. The most common problematic case between barrier healers is about the barriers that don't stack from spells. If 2 sages use Eve Creation Prognosis, the biggest shields will prevail. The same applies generally to 2 scholars applying their shields, Succor, Consultation, or Adloquium. The bigger shields win. However, with Sage and Scholar, they always override shields with the most recent shield between each other, with the singular exception that a Sage's Eve Creation Diagnosis shield cannot be overridden by anything except a bigger Eucratian Diagnosis shield. The important lesson here is that if your co-healer is also a barrier healer, then it is a very good idea to think a bit extra before using your barrier spells, in case you might replace an existing shield. This is particularly important for sages, as the fact their barrier spells are instant means some sages tend to just throw out a shield if they happen to reposition anyway and things like that. This can be a problem because an Eucratian Prognosis could override a 3 times larger shield from a scholar's recitation at Loquium deployment tactics. Number 6. Limit Break. This one is a more general tip, but in case you don't know about it, the Limit Break is, in PvE content, a shared resource that if one player uses it, everyone loses it, so it matters who uses it. In PvP, the Limit Break gauge is your own. Now, the Healer Limit Break, specifically the Limit Break 3 version, is, when needed, by far the most powerful of all the Limit Breaks. Healer Limit Break 1 and 2 simply heals the raid for 25% or 60% of their total HP, which is not that impressive. Limit Break 3, on the other hand, fully heals everyone in the party and also raises any players that happen to be dead with full HP without applying the weakness or brink of death debuffs that normally are applied. When it comes down to raw numbers, the Healer Limit Break is actually beneficial to use if it raises at least 2 players, but in most cases, saving it for, say, 3 or even 4 dead, if the numbers are piling up anyway, is usually not a bad idea. There is of course also the consideration that using Healer LB3 to raise only 2 players may seem a bit aggressive in a lot of parties. But the important part is to not be afraid of using the Limit Break if you get the impression your party could really benefit from it. After all, part of the reason a lot of DPS players tend to wait with the Limit Break until they can finish a boss with it, that's a bit late anyway, is to save it for the healers. Number 7. When things go sideways. Sometimes things just don't work out the way you expected. Sometimes the tank pulls way more than is wise to, sometimes they pull way more than they are capable of, sometimes a raid boss mechanic suddenly just goes wrong and half the raid is dead. Here it is important to remember, first off, that it is okay to cast healing spells. The potential loss if anyone dies vastly outranks any potential damage lost by you not attacking. Remember to make use of your MP management options, Lucid Dreaming and the job-specific ones, as when these things happen, the MP demand can quickly skyrocket. Making sure to keep the ones alive staying that way is a lot more important than getting too caught up in raising the ones that are dead. This is a common trap to get caught in when things go completely off track. Save those that can yet be saved first, then raise more. Or, if it is an option, remember Limit Break. Obviously, if a boss mechanic is coming up that requires more bodies, you can be caught between a rock and a hard place. But if the ones alive don't get the healing they need, you will be forced to raise them too. In dungeons, and some trials and raids, if the tanks go down, giving a DPS a lot of extra attention may also allow them to tank until the tanks are back on their feet, or at least for a little bit. Extra attention can both include spam healing and using your defensive cooldowns on them. I hope you found some of this advice helpful, and if you have any tips for healers of your own, please be sure to leave them in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, back in A Realm Reborn, jobs didn't have distinctly unique LB3s, as both tanks used Paladin's Big Wall, melees used Monk's Punch, mages used Black Mage's Meteor, and healers and Bard used White Mage's Prayer. Bard also used the healer LB1 and 2. These specific limit breaks originally being more universal probably explains why Paladin, White Mage and Monk just uses their hands for theirs. Monk is more excused. And Black Mage summons a special fancy schmancy staff for their meteor cast.